The aim of Horses Inside Out is to show how understanding anatomy can improve performance and reduce the risk of injury. We all have the welfare of our horses in mind, and that is why we're ever striving to increase our knowledge of anatomy and movement to improve the lot of our equine partners. But we're not the first to do this, and that's why I thought it would be fascinating to look at some aspects of the history of the study of anatomy and movement and some historical figures that I find inspiring. First of all, let's look at the work of George Stubbs, a talented horse painter working in the mid-18th century who changed the perception of equine anatomy. Perhaps he is most famous for his painting of the Marquis of Rockingham's racehorse, Whistlejacket. But what set George Stubbs and his painting of horses apart from other artists of the time was his understanding of their anatomy. In 1756 to 1758, living in a farmhouse in Hawkstow near Hull, he spent 18 months dissecting horses, making elaborate notes and drawings of his findings. The conditions under which he worked would be considered unacceptable in today's world. So great was his thirst for knowledge, Stubbs would carefully remove the superficial layers, then spend a whole day measuring, drawing, and describing what he found. He would then repeat the process layer by layer until the whole horse was done. Stubbs claimed to have worked on one carcass for 11 weeks. Imagine the smell! From this gruesome work, Stubbs produced an impeccably ordered and beautiful game-changing book, The Anatomy of the Horse, published in 1766. The reason I say it was a game-changer was because before this, the only book to dedicate its contents to the anatomy of the horse was a book by the Italian author Carlo Ruini, published in 1598. The anatomical drawings in this book, however, were heavily based on human anatomical works published years before by Andreas Vesalius. Its images and text, including the errors, were repeated, copied and used by the farriers of the day for veterinary understanding. So Stubbs's work wasn't just useful for artists, but it helped to further a more correct understanding of anatomy based on dissection. This would be instrumental in improving equine welfare and furthering veterinary knowledge of the time. Despite Stubbs's meticulous study of anatomy, his understanding of the horse's gaits were not as accurate. Most paintings of galloping horses by artists of the day showed horses in a moment of suspension with the fore and hind limbs stretched out in front and behind. But the misunderstandings and debate about how horses move date much further back than Stubbs's time. There was question about whether the horse had a moment of suspension during faster speeds, not just gallop, but trotting and pace as well. According to Plato, how horses move was a subject that was warmly debated by the ancient Egyptians. Xenophon and many other writers of ancient times describe the great importance of correct knowledge of the various functions of the limbs in locomotion. However, none of these distinguished authors left any real information as to the manner in which the various movements they write about are executed. Fast forward to the mid-17th century, and the first book to have any real detail about how horses moved was A General System of Horsemanship by the Duke of Newcastle in 1659. This finely illustrated book included a chapter on the movements of the horse in all his natural paces. However, the descriptions of the faster paces were not quite correct, and so the uncertainty about horse movement rumbled on until in 1872 in San Francisco, the debate about horse movement came to a head. Enter Leland Stanford, as well as a wealthy American businessman. He was a breeder and owner of standardbred and thoroughbred racehorses. To settle the matter of how horses moved, Leland wanted to prove this with a photograph of a galloping horse. So he hired Edward Muybridge, a pioneering English-born photographer, to resolve the question. Initially, Muybridge thought it wouldn't be possible to photograph a horse galloping at full speed, especially considering the velocity of the limbs during protraction. In the early days of photography, film had to be exposed for several minutes and the subject had to remain motionless. Neck braces were often used, and this is why no one smiles in early portraits. Anything that moved came out as a blur. So Muybridge needed to significantly reduce exposure time to be able to capture a picture of a galloping horse. After experimenting with various equipment and chemicals, Muybridge settled the matter with a single photographic negative showing one of Stamford's racehorses mid-gallop. Following this, Stamford asked Muybridge to capture a sequence of photographs showing the horse's full gallop. To achieve this seemingly impossible task, Muybridge used 12 state-of-the-art cameras, which he designed himself, lined up parallel to the horse's path. The shutters of each camera were controlled by tripwires that lay across the horse's path and were triggered by his feet. The result, 12 photographs illustrating the full stride cycle of Stamford's horse, Sally Gardner. Taking 11 of these images and using his own invention, the zoom praxiscope, Muybridge was able to show a slow-motion version of the galloping horse. This clip, barely 2 seconds long, is considered to be the world's first motion picture, a proto-motive. And I just think it's amazing that basically the world's first ever movie was of a galloping horse. Muybridge's accomplishment was reported widely throughout the world, and many began to hail Muybridge as a photographic wizard. When it began to appear that Muybridge was stealing the limelight, Stamford tried to discredit him. In the book The Horse in Motion, as shown by instantaneous photography, written by Stamford's friend, Muybridge was mentioned merely as a Stamford employee in a technical appendix and given no credit for his phenomenal achievement. Muybridge and Stamford parted ways. Muybridge went on to receive support and funding from the University of Pennsylvania. Here he developed, improved and refined his system and method for recording the action of the horse. This photograph shows his setup with 24 cameras, and you can see the tripwires in the foreground used to set off the cameras. He also had other lines of cameras to capture the same movement from in front, behind and oblique angles. This resulted in the most comprehensive study of animals in motion that the world has ever seen. Between 1883 and 1886, he made a total of 100,000 images, working under the auspices of the University of Pennsylvania. He recorded horses in all gaits, performing a range of different movements. His last 2 books are still recognised as authorities on the movement and gaits of man and the horse. There have been many modern reproductions of these books. Students of animal motion sooner or later find their way back to the monumental photographic work of Edward Muybridge. However, in the 130 odd years since these photographs were taken, preferred breed types and riding styles have changed. In many of the photographs, and particularly in this one, we can see the horse's movement is influenced by the rider. This is not the only horse to be photographed with his mouth open, his way of going clearly influenced by rider and tack, a reflection perhaps of what was normally accepted at the time. This leads to the question about what is normal versus what is correct, and this is something that still applies today. It is amazing to think how the ingenuity and tenacity of George Stubbs and Edward Muybridge has paved the way for anatomists, biomechanists, veterinarians, researchers and equestrians of today. Over the last 5 years, I have been working on creating my own catalogue of equine movement. one which shows a variety of modern day horses performing all gaits and a variety of movements, but with a horse's inside out twist. Anatomy in action.